The Last of Us Season 1 finished a week ago when I'm recording this. Probably be slightly more than a week by the time I upload this because I've got another video that I literally just recorded that is going up before this. But let's talk about The Last of Us Season 1. Mainly because I am a negative Nancy, I think is what some people refer to people like me as. That sounded really camp, unintentionally. I'm quite a negative person, there you go, let's put it that way. And I want to talk about some elements of the show that did not quite work for me as a massive fan of the game. The first game I love, I'd even go as far as to say I liked the second game for the most part, which is going to get me some flack. I can already see the comments now of people telling me that I'm stupid because I enjoyed the majority of the second game. But anyway, Season 1 just finished last week. I've had some time to think about it and sort of process all my thoughts. Let's get into whether or not, compared to the game, the show was a little bit disappointing. I'd like to stress before we start getting in depth with some of the things I didn't particularly like, that for the most part I did genuinely really like this series. I think as far as video game adaptations go, this is up there with the best. It might even be the best. With that being said, I don't think it should be held up as one of the greatest TV shows of all time, like a lot of people have been regarding it as, because there are some issues that I personally have with some elements of how they adapted certain bits of the game. The first thing I have an issue with, which we're just going to get this out of the way right now, where were the zombies or the infected in this show? Because there's not a lot of them, really. Like, over half the show doesn't have any of them in a single episode, and when they do appear, it's one, maybe two, no more than that. Which is kind of strange considering most of the plot of the game and the show revolves around trying to manufacture a cure because Ellie is immune. But you don't really see any threats apart from in maybe one episode that indicates that the world really needs saving. The end of episode 5 is the only time throughout this entire series where I felt like that the world was actually kind of a threatening place to live in. In the game, obviously, throughout the entire thing, you're fighting many mercenaries and people coming after you, and many infected, bloaters, clickers, going underground, all sorts of stuff like that. But here they're sorely absent for most of the show, which was kind of a letdown, to be honest, because the clickers only really appear twice, I think, in this entire show. But the action scene at the end of episode 5 was one of my favourite parts of the entire show, with the bloater and ripping that guy's head, and that was incredibly cool. But where were the infected for the rest of the show? Even when we got to episode 8, which I think is probably the best episode of the entire show, with David and Ellie and that whole situation that happens, even in the game, there's a part where you're surrounded by clickers and you spend a couple of minutes just taking down clickers. They could have added at least a couple into the episode, but they didn't. And I don't really understand why. It kind of takes away from the threat of the world. That's my first negative of this show. Although the drama surrounding that, for the most part throughout this show, was pretty excellent, and the acting was pretty excellent too for the majority of this show. Moving on to negative number 2, I've got to kind of be not really careful, but how I word this is kind of important, because as a standalone episode, I really liked episode 3, the Bill and Frank episode. But as a purist of the game, I didn't really appreciate how they spent the longest episode of the entire show on that. Like, as a standalone episode of TV, it's incredibly well written, acted, it's emotional, it's heartfelt. But them deviating from the game so much for a character, Bill mainly, who you spend maybe 45 minutes, maybe not even quite that long, of the game with, and they spend an hour and a quarter of an episode developing his entire relationship with Frank. Frank's not even in the game. You hear him mentioned, and then you see him hanging because he's killed himself. But they spent the longest episode of the entire show developing this love story between characters that in the grand scheme of things in the game aren't actually that important. You know, it's just, it was a weird decision. That's why I have to kind of be careful how I explain why this is a negative, because I think it's an incredibly great episode. I'm not taking it away from the show as a whole. I just don't understand why they spent the whole episode developing that, and they changed the outcome as well. In the game, you meet up with Bill, you go into the gymnasium at the school, you fight your first bloater. It's incredibly cool. I was really excited to see that get adapted, and it just didn't. Instead, you've got this love story where ultimately at the end they both decide to take their own lives, which is kind of a tragedy. It could have been extended into its own movie, but it didn't really add anything to the story of the show. So on one hand, I understand why they did it, because they obviously saw the actors had chemistry, they wanted to flesh these characters out. But what was the point? You know, what was the actual point? You could have just spent another episode with Joel and Ellie. You could have done the gymnasium fight scene. I think fans would have been a little bit more satisfied overall if you actually added some of that cool action from that segment of the game into the episode, but they just don't. It's baffling, because I really like the episode, but at the same time it's kind of pointless. I'd also like to mention how they make a big deal, and I think episode 2, of setting up this thing that replaces spores. You know, in the games you have spores, you've got to put a mask on, you're crawling around in these dimly lit underground areas, which is some of my favourite segments of the games. But in this show they replaced that with this sort of hive mind type thing, where there's these like kind of vine type infections that sort of spread off, and if you step on them they vibrate and then wake up all the infected in the area. You see that in effect precisely once in this entire show, in episode 2, just before Tess bites the dust, and then it's just never really brought up again. It's a really cool concept that I actually didn't mind them getting rid of spores to replace it with that, but again, they just used it for one episode and forgot about it. Why? It's like, I'm sorry. Most of the show is incredibly well written and acted, but that is such a poorly written element that's just completely forgotten about. You could have used that multiple times in this show to emphasise the danger that the characters are going to be in, and the writers just didn't bother whatsoever. It's another baffling thing, like the episode 3 thing I literally just mentioned. It's another baffling thing that they extended a storyline that didn't need to be extended for episode 3, and then they introduce this element that replaces an integral part of the game, and they just forget about it. Why? This next one I haven't seen too many people really complain about, but it's one thing that I'm not too negative on, but I just preferred how it was in the game, which is kind of how I feel about a decent amount of the moments from this show that people tend to be talking about. But Joel's injury in the game, he gets pushed off of like a railing, it falls through the railing when he's getting into a tussle with somebody, and he gets like impaled and attacked and all sorts of interesting stuff like that. And in the show he gets stabbed with a broken baseball bat. It's a bit more realistic, but the way the game did it was so intense and so cool that I couldn't help but be a little bit let down with how they handled that in the show. You know, it was still a cool scene, a very well executed scene, but just compared to the game, again, it's just, maybe I just need to let go of my love for the game in a way and just say to myself, they're gonna change things. They can't adapt it completely verbatim. They're going to change some things, and you're going to have to deal with it. But at the same time, I've been a fan of this franchise since 2014 when I first played the first game. And I've kind of grown up with this franchise and replaying the game, so I kind of have relevant points to make, I think. So to answer the question that I kind of posed in this video, was The Last of Us Season 1 a letdown? I'd say mostly no, because I really enjoyed a majority of the episodes. I think that even though I was skeptical about the casting when it was first announced, Bella Ramsey, Pedro Pascal, pretty much everyone in this show did an amazing job with the characters that they were playing for the most part, and the way they adapted certain elements and parts from the game that I love was pretty much word for word. The fight scene in the hospital as well in the final episode where Joel goes on his rampage, I think was handled extremely well. They adapted pretty much the last scene of the game as the last scene of this show extremely well too. So there were a lot of great elements of this show. Just wish there was some more action and that they didn't focus and draw out bits that didn't need to be drawn out, and pace the story a little bit better, like adding characters that weren't in the game. Like there's people that they're fighting and dealing with in episodes 4 and 5. I think her name was Kathleen, I think. She just wasn't in the game, didn't need to be in the show either. It was just padding out runtime, but at the same time she wasn't really that good of a villain either. Just slightly confusing elements in an otherwise extremely good and faithful adaptation. I'm not going to rate the entire series, but I still think it is a great show overall. There's just certain things that baffled me as a fan. I don't understand why they changed, and I can understand why some people got pissed off with certain elements of this show. But I don't think the show was a letdown. I just think it had some disappointing elements in it simply because a lot of us have played the games and have grown up with the games, and we wanted almost a verbatim adaptation of something that we love, and 9 times out of 10 that never happens. But as video game adaptations go, this is probably the best one. The faithful moments are excellent. My favourite scene of the entire game is the scene where Ellie runs off on a horse and then goes into that house, and her and Joel have the conversation about who they've lost. They adapted that pretty much again word for word from the game. The context of how they get to that house is different in that episode, but that is one of my favourite scenes in the show as well. The acting in that's phenomenal. So the moments that they do take straight from the game, I think were handled extremely well. So what do you guys think of The Last of Us Season 1? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you have some of the same criticisms as I do? I really want to know. And I'll see you guys probably, I want to say on Friday, because John Wick 4, almost said 3, John Wick 4's coming out, and the reviews of that are absolutely phenomenal. So I'm very excited to go and watch that. See you guys later. Goodbye.